Hello everyone, and welcome to this regional webinar on racism, xenophobia and discrimination in the Pacific context. This is the last webinar of a series of 8 regional webinars that the WCC and the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs have been organizing since August this year. The purpose of these webinars is to explore regionally how racism, xenophobia, Afrophobia, and racial discrimination manifest themselves in each region. What are the different expressions of racial injustice in each region? This webinar is part of the WCC Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace because the 2019 thematic focus is racism. And this very last webinar will be focusing on the Pacific context, Pacific being the regional focus of the 2020 WCC Pilgrimage Justice and Peace. So this is an invitation and introduction to the region of the Pacific. This webinar will be moderated by Reverend Sepiuta Sepi Halapiapi. She was a former member of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs, and she currently sits on the Executive Committee of the Pacific Council of Churches. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sedma. Nisambula Vinaka, Malolele, Talofa Lava, Yorana, Maori, and greetings to you all, brothers and sisters. Welcome to all of you who are tuned in to this regional webinar, and also to those who will review this recording later. So before I get our speakers to introduce themselves and share their talanoa, I'd like to share that this is indeed an important topic, not only in other parts of the world, but as we will find out soon, also in our Pacific. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you all to this participate in this webinar. I'll just give a brief list of how the order of the speakers. So we will start off with Reverend James Bhagwan, followed by Ms. Elvira Rumkabu, and we'll have Reverend Nicotemo, followed by Reverend Dr. Seferosa, then Reverend Dr. Cliff Bird, and the 6th speaker is Ms. Tairua Tiare Mauhi. So we'll just go in that order. As we mentioned before, we'll speak up to 10 minutes. If anyone would like to make a comment or question, or if any of those who will join us later would like to share, ask a question or say something, you're most welcome to do that. And we hope to have this running for the most at 19, for the next hour or so. Thank you. We'll give now the floor, give the screen to Reverend James Bhagwan to start us off.
Well, thank you, Reverend Sepi. In fact, Reverend Sepi and I are both currently in Canberra, where we are gathered to meet with about 200 Christians, gathering to discuss and meet with Australian parliamentarians about the Australian government's Pacific Step Up and their Pacific Church Partnership program that they're trying to set up in the region. And this morning, addressing the one of the leaders of Australia, one of the things I mentioned was about the fact that often people look at Pacific Islands in a way that expects us to be asking for hand-ups and handouts, but we want equal partnership. And I think that goes back to the issue of perhaps the institutional racism we find in many organizations or across regions. And that's probably something we will hear more about tonight or this morning in our webinar. But just a little bit about myself. I'm the General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches. We're a fellowship of 31 churches across 16 Pacific Island countries. Hopefully by the end of the year, we will move up to 33 churches. The 4 major churches, indigenous churches in West Papua, are about to become full members of PCC. And our work covers a number of areas. And one of those is around self-determination. And in that aspect, we speak not only of political self-determination, but also cultural, social, and economic self-determination. And really that is around the way that we as Pacific Islanders would like to see our engagement with the rest of the world, whether it is in church, whether it is in development, at a way that respects the culture, the identity, the spirituality, but also the resilience and the indigenous knowledge that we bring and our own understanding of development. And in the context of of looking at discrimination or racism, that's something to keep in mind, that often our way of life, our Pacific way of life, is looked down on as least developed or less developed. But before I go any further, very quickly, I'd just like to share, in my own experience as someone who has Indo-Fijian heritage. My father's family and some of my mother's ancestry is from India, and their ancestors were brought over by the British to Fiji to work in the sugarcane fields during the colonial period. And so we've seen the way in which colonial structures work to separate communities, the old divide and conquer way of doing things and controlling power, and how after independence that unfortunately has been something that remains embedded in our communities in Fiji, despite our community's best efforts. It's something that's widely politicized, and so personally having that experience, and we continue to see those occur every now and then in our region, particularly in Fiji. We also had an interesting conversation this morning, and perhaps Reverend Seferosa can talk to this as in terms of her work with the Australian Uniting Church, the place of the Aboriginal community in Australia. It was interesting that I was at a function recently where the welcome to country, which is a very important part of any gathering of people in Australia. It is something that is perhaps part of our Pacific way, the traditional welcome to include us in the community of Indigenous people was actually left till almost the end of the program. And I could see the pain in our Aboriginal sisters and brothers when that happened. Here in the Pacific Conference of Churches, we're trying to see how we can engage with that, not only on a pastoral level, but really trying to look at some of that structural racism, structural discrimination. And I'm glad that Elvira is here to talk about the West Papua perspective, because that's been something we've seen quite recently, structural racism and human rights abuse based on racism in West Papua. I think I'll leave it for there, and we can continue to have the conversation with our other participants, and then I might jump in later. Thank you, Seppi.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, those are interesting comments to start us off. I forgot to mention at the beginning, I was trying to find what's the Pacific Island word for web, because we're not really used to using technology for Talanoa, but this is interesting. So this is sort of like a Talanoa, but with a bit of limits with the time. Thank you, Reverend James. Our next speaker is Reverend Dr. Seferosa.
Going to do my very best to speak briefly about racism in, over two contexts. And the first is Fiji, where I was born and grew up. And the second is in Australia as a migrant in diaspora. I guess one of the, I'm a Fiji-born Rutuman. I was born in Suva, but lived most of my life in the western part of the bigger island, Viti Levu, known as Lautoka. And the western side of Viti Levu is known to have a majority of the Indian population, well, at least at the time when I was growing up. And one of my experience growing up in Fiji was that although Fiji was a very multicultural, multiracial, multi-religious country, there was a socialization of hierarchies in terms of race or ethnicity and religions. So basically, I grew up with the understanding that Fijians were at the top of the hierarchy, and at the bottom of the hierarchy are the Indians, and in between these races fitted in. And being a Rotuman, I was actually a privileged cousin. So that was kind of the socialization of hierarchies that I grew up with or at the time. And this is going back many years ago, 40 years. And what I've come to realize is, as James said earlier, that the product of this or the outcome of this structure relates back to colonialism. In that dates right back also in terms of our indentured laborers, as James talked about, where they were brought in, organized and brought in by the British colonizers at the time. And they were specifically brought to actually develop Fiji's economy. And what I hadn't realized until many years later was that at school, I never got to hear the real story of the indentured laborers and the hardship and the discrimination that they faced, not only working in Fiji, but also the process of bringing them to Fiji to actually work the land. And that many, many, many years on, there is still a sense that, that this group of people can't really, or can they ever call Fiji home? And then, this relates in terms of relationship to land and also to culture. So that was the kind of sort of upbringing that I had. And it also related to religion and faith. So Christianity was seen as kind of the top of the hierarchy, and perhaps seen and understood to be the top religion, or the religion that holds truth. And again, there was a descending order of where other religions fitted into that structure. So when I came to Australia, it's kind of quite sad for me that my interreligious learning and cultural learning took place in a country outside my own, because my upbringing didn't allow me the space to actually interact and learn to appreciate people for who they are. So I guess that's kind of just in a nutshell the Fiji context. As a migrant in Australia, well, it's a well-known fact that we have the White Australia policy in terms of migration. And although Australia has moved to a policy of multiculturalism in 1975, I think that was the year, there is a sense that at the heart of multiculturalism, that the concept of assimilation is still there. What has played out in the national space is also the relationship between migrants and Indigenous, Aboriginal people. And the multiculturalism in Australia tends to play out in a metaphor of centre and periphery, where at the centre we have a certain culture, and that's usually the white host, and every other culture kind of takes its place around the periphery. And this has all come at the detriment of our own Indigenous people. So for me, it's just very interesting to see the dynamics of colonialism and power and privilege, and how that plays out, not only in terms of race, but also in things like faith. And that's where I'll leave it at for now. Thank you, Reverend Seppi.
Thank you, Dr. Sefrosa. I think it's really interesting to hear you share two different experiences. Like you mentioned, being a Rotuman, growing up in Fiji, and then later being a part of the diaspora community in Australia. Yes, I think if anyone would like to share any comments on that.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, I think again, just a couple of things there. One of the interesting things or the challenges when we take what Seferosa has been saying in her presentation, and you look at it now in the context of migrant labor in many countries, and in the Pacific, of course, one of the things we've been discussing in the last couple of days is the seasonal worker program and the Pacific Mobility Program that Australia has. New Zealand also has a seasonal worker program, which many Pacific Island communities participate in. In Australia, it's Vanuatu, which has the highest number of workers in Australia, followed by Tonga, Fiji, Solomon Islands, and Samoa. In New Zealand, we have Fijian workers, Samoan and Tongan workers. One of the issues has been around the treatment of these workers. And of course, we are Pacific Islanders are not the only migrant workers in these countries. But just speaking from the Pacific perspective, one of the challenges we face is how Pacific Islanders are viewed. We have situations where people expect, oh, these guys are used to sleeping on floors, they're used to sleeping in huts, they're used to cooking outside. And then you have the case of, in places where the temperature gets very, very cold in Australia, you have women who have to camp in a caravan with no insulation. The cooking facilities are outside, or they have to share beds and things like that. And it was quite interesting in our meeting today. Some of us church leaders met the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and he was sharing one of the projects that they're trying to do is to see how they can improve on the accommodation aspect and the social aspect, to recognize that Pacific Islanders, we exist in community. We don't just do things on our own. And that is a source of strength and can also be a source of vulnerability for our Pacific Island people when they are working in other countries. I'm just reflecting something that, on what Seferosa was saying. And also, the issue of religion. We've had situations in the history of the churches in the Pacific where we have seen some of that racial discrimination hampering the growth of indigenous churches as part of the colonial attitudes of missionaries from other parts of the world, from Australia, from New Zealand, from England, and sometimes from the US. Thank you.
Naka. We'll now hear from Reverend Nicotemo.
Happy. I think I would like to begin by stating that before I worked with the Council for World Mission, I was with the Presbyterian Church of Fiji. Before that, I worked in the Northern Pacific at the Federated States of Micronesia. And we hardly hear of the issue of racism and xenophobia, discrimination in these islands. Maybe because they are separated from the rest of the Pacific. I think they're more attached to the United States and not so much part of the United States churches and politics. Nevertheless, I would like to speak on something called the unconscious biasness in racism that is very hard for us to detect, but it's very much alive in these small islands, specifically in the Federated States of Micronesia, in small islands like Nauru, in Kiribati and Tuvalu. There's not many other races that lives there, but when you live among these people, you will detect that they have this unconscious biasness towards others. And sometimes it's very hard for them to detect themselves because it has become embedded, it's been structured into their societal fabrics that into the fabric that run the society every day. We can see this through the words they say. They have words that group of people. You know, for example, in the Federated State of Micronesia, in the island of Pohnpei, have words for a white person, and then they have word for person who is not a Micronesian. And these words in the root words for the words that I use don't really sound good. You know, they say Menwai is somebody from outside, Men Namanam, somebody who does not belong. So, so these words I use daily. They are used without really considerable thoughts to the effect they have on the lives of people who understand the language. But also, even if people don't understand the language, we can see uh, the fear that is within the people that generate such name calling and name tagging. Uh, one of the most dangerous thing to me in the issue of racism, all island states, is that when they come into bigger countries like Fiji, or when they go to Australia and New Zealand, they are easily absorbed into racial and religious tensions. They like Seth have mentioned about religion issues. In these islands, there's not other religion but Christianity, and therefore, when they come into to bigger countries, it's very easy for them to side with people who have Islamic phobia or any other kind of things. These divisions among the people continues. It is sort of ingrained into their very existence, into their very being, their very belief. It's in their minds, it's in their thoughts. It's part of who they are. The most dangerous thing about this is that they will call it culture, they will call it tradition. It's a way of life. It's the way things are back home. They are just. That's why I said that I want to address it as an issue of unconscious biasness, unconscious racism that exists in our small islands. Not so much here in Fiji. I was born in Fiji. I'm more like Seth. I'm not a Tauke Fiji, but Tuvaluan who was born and raised here in Fiji. And I grew up hearing words that define who I am as not being a Fijian. And it's very obvious. You can see racism in Fiji is very open through the language, body language, or through the words that people say, but not in the small islands. People say it unconsciously. What I want to really highlight here is it exists right throughout the Pacific.
Reverend Nicotemo. I guess I could also relate with that. I'm a Tongan born in Fiji. Well, some of what you shared is similar. Growing up, we're all part of that unconscious biasness. Yeah, and it got me thinking as well, preparing for this. You think about racism and racial discrimination as well. Now I'd like to invite from West Papua, Ms. Elvira, if you could share with us, introduce yourself and share your Talanoa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So hi, I'm Elvira, and it's such a wonderful opportunity for me to share my reflection on racism in West Papua. And I just want to share about my reflections on what has been happening since this August 2019. I believe that you have heard about the wave of both peaceful and violent protests in West Papua since this August. And my specific elaboration will be more on understanding racism in Papua as a structural, but also the racism itself is integral to the construction of Papuan identity. That's the first one. The second one is just going to focus on how the government responds to racism protests in West Papua this past 3-4 months. So the wave of protest, as you know, or most of you know, that it began in early August, where it was sparked by the viral video that's shared by many about the racist slurs being targeted by about the viral video that's shared by Indonesian military officers taunting Papuan students with racist slurs, calling the students dog, monkey. It took place in Surabaya on 16 August. And then 3 days later, interestingly, the social media, this video become viral, and then the young people in West Papua, they responded it, they took social media, and then they tried to mobilize themselves and calling for actions. And then 19 August, in such only 3 days, and then there are a lot of protests. It is about 30 protests in almost 30 cities in Indonesia, including in Papua and some places outside Papua. So for indigenous Papuan, the demonstration began as a fight against racism that back to history of colonialism, and some of you have mentioned about how it being structural, and then we have to go back to see that colonialism actually determine or influence the construction of racism itself. But also, what is interesting in Papua, starting from this August until now, is I want to specifically look on how actually the government responded to this protest. This is actually a peaceful protest, but then it's interesting to see when the protest took place on 19 August, our president Jokowi, and then he made a public statement that let's stick together, uh, be let's be calm, and then let's have a dialogue on this crisis, and we're gonna find the solution. It sounds really good, sounds like a peaceful plan. But 2 days afterwards, the Minister of the Security Affairs sent 1,500 military officers to Papua to respond to these situations. And the second response, which I think one of the interesting things is that there is the internet shutdown only 2 days after the demonstrations. The government stopped the internet without giving only the press conference, without giving any other official statement, and then they just disconnect the internet. The government said that is very important to do that because they want to um, they want to they want to prevent spread of hoax and also false news, and also that can provoke the violence. That is the second response. The third response is that arresting a lot of activists and then also those who involved in the demonstration. And also there are the head of the police also issued the controversial 6-point order that banned the demonstration in Papua and West Papua province until now. So looking on this response, this is just some of a number of response that has been taken by the government of Indonesia. But what to learn from this is, I think the first one, as you already mentioned before, some of speakers already mentioned, is like in Papua, racism is also structural. But in Papua, racism is integral to the construction of Papuan identity as an oppressed identity. If you look back to the colonialism, since Papua became a part under the Dutch colonization, the segregation or the discrimination and also racism already there, because there is what they call as 2 layers of the governance in the Dutch colonialism, which put the Indonesian people, the Dutch people on the first layers, the second layers Indonesian people, and the third layers is the Papuan people. When Indonesia took over the Papuans, and then as you know that there are a lot of human rights violences, failure of development, and Papua become an oppressed identity. So racism is very integral to Papuan identity, and we talk about the racism is not just experiences, but it is attached in the identity of Papua itself. And also, I think as a Papuan woman, as an indigenous Papuan woman, I also feel I also experience the racism in my daily experiences, verbal racism, especially if I just because I finished my studies in Java, and also those kind of racist slurs it's become our daily experiences as a Papuan. So, and also I think that racism in Papua manifests hugely in everything, not only on the verbal, but also we're talking about racism manifest in the policy. talking about the investment that in favor to the corporation, not to the indigenous Papuan. Racism in the way how the government look on the Papuan people itself. So racism is structural in Papua. It's deeply rooted in specific historical, political, and socio-cultural context that construct Papuan as oppressed people. And that's how we Papuan people look at ourselves. We're not looking at ourselves as a victim, but as an oppressed identity. And the second thing I think that we can learn from the response that's been taken by the government so far is that, well, there is no better future for the racism to be tackled because as we can see that the response of the government is very repressive, and I believe that the response it depends on how the state look on Papua and how the government look on Papua, look on us, only as every struggle in Papua will be easily labeled or stigmatized as a separatist. That's how they respond the racists when the protest, even though it's a protest regarding to the racism, but the way the government, the way the state look on the Papua as the oppressed, but also as a stigmatized as a separatist people, that lead them to have a very repressive policy like the internet shutdown, the arresting activists until now, the military deployment. So yeah, so maybe I think that's two things that I want to share about the racism in West Papua. Thank you.
Thank you, Elvira. Well, you've led us to a different perspective of racism, as you mentioned, and we've heard a lot about what happens in West Papua. Thank you for sharing your Talanoa with us. I'm sure we'll have time to further share any more comments if anyone would want to add, especially of what's happening in West Papua. We have two more speakers, and before we open up for Talanoa, we'll move on to now Dr. Cliff Bird. Is Dr. Cliff online? No. Okay, we will move on to Ms. Tiare Mauhi. Tiare Mauhi? Yeah.
Yes.
Tiare will give you...
My name is Tiare Mauhi. Yes, give you the floor.
Yes, please continue.
My name is Tiare Mauhi and I am from Mauhi Nui. It is a privilege for me to talk about the reality of the racism, xenophobia, and the racial discrimination in my context as a Mauhi young woman from Mauhi Nui, incorrectly called French Polynesia. I am an active member of the Mauhi Protestant Church. Through the YMCA in my parish and in my island, I frequently work with youth and for the youth, especially the Maui young people. The racism, xenophobia, racial discrimination exist here as everywhere else, but differently. Those topics have a common point, which is the injustice, in my opinion. The biggest challenge is to have a sharp eyes to observe what is really happening where some people do not see. And the more important challenge is to be able to see in order to help the others to see also. Most of all, to be able to denounce those injustices. For example, the entire world believes that the first and the official language here is the French because of the name French Polynesia. And the French government continues to cover the light of the Reo Maohi in our land. Reo Maohi, the language of. I would like you to understand that the first language here is the Reo of the land, the language of our land called Maohinui. The mother tongue here is the Reo Maohi, and I am one of the Maohi people who will continue to proclaim the existence and the legitimacy of the Reo Maohi in our country. It is very important for me to be clear in this point because, in my opinion, this is one of the big injustices here. For the Maohi, the Reo Maohi is the essence of the nation. Without our language, we are a body without soul and without spirit. Furthermore, the wisdom of our culture says that when the language is clean, the way of life of the nation will be clean. That's why we encourage our people to learn, to talk, and to live the Reo Maohi. Because this is a way of life which motivates people to see each other, to understand each other, to accept each other, to live together despite our differences. We cannot deny that the language is the vehicle of the knowledge and the wisdom of our nation, my nation, Maohi. That's why in our language, the word Maohi has a deep meaning. Most of all, love and respect yourself. Who loves and respects himself, respect his neighbor. There will be neither high nor low. There is you and there is me. But here in Maohinui, French Polynesia, there is you and only you. That is for me the racial discrimination here in Maohinui. Another point, in my opinion here, at school, the system of education continues to cover the light of our mother tongue. And also, the nuclear testing was a big issue for us because they killed and they continue to kill our land and our spirit and our people. That's all for me. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Thierry Mahi. So now you've heard the Talanoa shared by the different speakers. If it's online. Open the floor now for any further comments.
Yeah, it's me again. Thank you, Sepi. We've heard some very, very important and very serious issues raised across all the contexts. And this is the challenge that we face because a lot of this racism is not only socialized, it's institutionalized. And ultimately it goes back to the issue of power and control. And so that's something that's of serious concern that we need to take note of. You have the institutional racism that takes place, there's structural violence and structural racism in West Papua that continues to this day, where like in Maohi, the language is the language of the colonizer. The cultural practices of the people are undermined as a way of control and maintaining power. And this is something that is really serious. I mean, today we had a panel discussion here in Parliament between Pacific Islanders and Aboriginal leaders, Pacific church leaders and Aboriginal church leaders. And, you know, it was so sad to hear that up until 1963, the Indigenous people, the Aboriginal people of Australia, were considered part of the flora and fauna of the country. So that means that we're not even considered human beings, you know. 1967 is when they got full citizenship. Between 1963 and 1967 was the journey. And, you know, that's in this day and age, in the 20th century. Now we're in the 21st century, and we see the same thing happening and continuing in West Papua. You know, during the situation, the most recent conflict, and I'll call it a conflict because, you know, this is when people are trying to exert their power and authority over another group of people, and they're using the violence of language. They're using the violence of emotional violence, you know, and then of course physical violence. West Papuan people responded in protest. It was an excuse for the military to send in 1,000 more troops from Indonesia. You know, and this is another example of the structural racism that the people of West Papua face. And as Tiari Mauhi has mentioned, with the context of Mauhi Nui, you know, the struggle to have your own language, and often, of course, it is seen as a symbol of resistance, but it's how we respond to it as well at the same time. I just want to reflect on something that Nico was talking about, you know, and Seppi, you touched on it as well in terms of, you know, migrants, and Nico was talking about, you know, this context of Micronesia. There is a concern that I have sometimes that even within the Pacific, amongst our own people, there is some sort of racism that we see, or whether we call it discrimination, in the way that Pacific Islanders view other Pacific Islanders. You know, we have been divided into sub-regions by the colonizers. You know, Micronesia, meaning the small islands, you know, which is a demeaning way of describing that community. We have, you know, Melanesia, the black people, you know, and we have Polynesia, and often sometimes there is a tendency I've seen sometimes to see some, you know, and I have to be honest here. Sometimes I see that Polynesians might place themselves above the Melanesians because of that light and dark perspective that has been imposed again by colonial powers. And then sometimes it's like I feel for our Micronesian communities that are almost like, you know, like the cousins from the country, sort of left away out of the conversation, as Nico was talking about, and struggling with, you know, with the oppression from places like the United States and how they are treated. You know, and this has been something that we have seen our Melanesian sisters and brothers particularly face when they come to Fiji, when they engage in other regional places. This, you know, we look at that aspects rather than what gifts they have to offer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Dr. Seth, would you like to share something?
No, I mean, it's just you know, again, affirming how not only colonization plays in the process and continues to play out, you know, even now, but also the narratives that we also form to actually shape nations and shape people and others. For example, I think recently, well, a few months ago in Fiji, the term Vulangi was introduced into politics by a SUDELPA member. And I mean, I've always understood Valangi to be maybe not so much a neutral word, but a word that has positive connotations most of the times. But the context in which this term was used in Fiji was to actually really say that there are some people that actually don't belong in a nation. That kind of politics also plays out in Australia, that there are people who are in and there are people who are out. And it's also the language and the narratives that we use to actually further marginalize and other people, to actually give them. And I think Elvira talked about identity and how we kind of shape people's otherness. So that's like one of the things that is a common thread that seems to be running through all the stories that we've heard tonight.
Thank you. We've been reminded that this year's thematic focus is on racism, and next year our Pacific region for 2020 will focus on, the WCC will focus on the pilgrimage of justice and peace in our region, I believe. So I feel it's really interesting that our Talanoas will also be shared into the new year. Would anyone like to offer some last comments?
I think it's really important. I think that the power of naming is very important, and I think that there is something in being able to name the issues and to tell the story that that can bring about transformational change. But sometimes, I guess my concern sometimes is that is how we can keep the stories real and honest, and yet at the same time cultivate spaces that enable people, well, all of us as a community, to actually keep moving forward. One of my concerns at the moment, and I'm still thinking through what this means, is that even though we talk about post-colonial in that we're past the colonial times, there's still the question of whether or not we're actually post-colonial, because many of our practices still remain colonial. And my concern at the moment is how we kind of say, or the West says, that we're adopting a post-colonial rhetoric or narrative, but the practice is still very much a colonial model. And this can be a very dangerous kind of way to be, because just because we speak a post-colonial narrative or rhetoric kind of masks the actions that are still colonial. And so, and I think this is one of the ways that racism, xenophobia, and discrimination actually goes underground. In that we kind of say, well, it's still there, but it's masked by a kind of different narrative and rhetoric that is called post-colonial. And I think that we need to watch that, because otherwise our practices of mission continue to be the same. And that, I think, is a challenge for the global church.
Yes, I agree completely. Nico, were you going to say something? Sorry.
Yes, James. Very much, Seth, for mentioning that. I think it is very important with the issue of racism in the Pacific. I was thinking as I was listening into a different perspective, the different stories tonight, how we used to be in the Pacific for contact with the outside world of before what we call the pre-European contact. How the ocean have no barriers, and then how we sail the ocean freely as people of the ocean rather than people of each islands. Also, I understand there are some dark histories in our past, but I like the idea of how freely we move around these parts of the world, trading with each other and exchanging gifts with each other. I want to bring that into our conversation tonight, looking at our theologies. And Seth was mentioning colonialism. Sometimes I find it very difficult that most of us in the Pacific are doing post-colonial theologies. And we have our brothers and sisters in West Papua and Maui Nui who have yet to reach their state because they are still fighting the colonial powers, literally. And theologies is also, our theologies in the Pacific need to change the way we do theologies. I think we have begun, or we have moved into the changing of our theologies in the institutions, in theological institutions, in ecumenical institutions, but we have not taken that further step in our local churches. And we can hear that in the sermons that are preached. When we go into our communities and we find things like what I mentioned, unconscious biasness, that will tell us that what the message from the pulpit has not changed. So because our liturgies have not really changed. Liturgies and theologies that contributes to racism, to the dividing of people according to their colors. Because I am one person who totally disagree with the term Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia, because of what Reverend James mentioned. These terms, this tells us the color of our skin and how we look like. You have frizzy hair and you have straight hair. That's what this term means. And they mean nothing at all to me as a person of the Pacific, as a Pacifica person. So I think, apart from everything else that we mentioned, our theologies now, liturgies, need to change. It will change our mission. Not only in our institution, I think we need to encourage students who comes into our institutions, leaders to come into forums and meetings whenever we have the chance to, when they return to take this up at the local setting and not just at the regional setting. I think most of the things we do it at the regional level. We fail to take this down to the grassroots, to the local level, where racism really takes place. And lastly, James says, before I go, the issue of our beloved Fiji, it has to do with the leadership. If our political leadership, we turn on the television and listen to our parliaments every day. Every time we find people raising an issue of racism, even though they try to hide it with things like indigenization and all of this, racism at the core. So these things need to be dealt with truly, honestly, as Seth mentioned, and I think it's a beginning. At least we take a step forward in dealing with the issue of racism, xenophobia, and discrimination in our region. Thank you, Seth.
Thank you.
Seppi, if I can just quickly add on to what Nico has said. This issue, I mean, and again, thank you, Nico, for bringing it just quickly to Fiji for a moment, because Fiji is different in a way from a number of the other Pacific Island communities in that they have not only different ethnic groups within the community, but that ethnicity is also connected to different religions. And that's something to also take in mind, because when we start looking at race in Fiji, you also are connected to how people look at religion, and vice versa. We have just, the Christchurch terror attacks that took place in New Zealand earlier this year, took a big step, or were part of a big step as a result of Christian leaders coming to embrace the Muslim community. And I'm talking from the Fiji perspective. It represented a very big opportunity for us to make a step across that racial, ethnic religious divide. Unfortunately, after we shared our condolences and our solidarity, I haven't seen any of the Fijian church communities move beyond to start to say maybe there's a need for us to have more interreligious dialogue. And PCC will pick up on that. That's our commitment. But it's also important that it's not us trying to impose within the country. It's important for us to see, as you said, the not just national government leaders, but also national church leaders taking this on board. We need to pay attention to that. Now with China moving into the Pacific in terms of the Chinese government and its whether you want to call it aid or it's coming into the region with using money, and a lot of the work is around the Belt and Roadway initiatives, where Chinese workers are now being brought in many cases to do a lot of that work. What dynamic will that add into the region as well? Because there are a number of Pacific Island territories and countries now that are switching from Taiwan to China, that will see a bigger influence of China coming in. That will see a lot more, China playing a bigger role in how it tries to control the Pacific. The recent 60 Minutes story that was done by Australian 60 Minutes, which talked about China coming in, looking at trying to take over Bougainville economically and its economic work, that will have an effect on how our frustrations with the state of China in terms of our relationship with Chinese people. I mean, that's going to be something that we have to consider. And our role as churches, how do we work in that context? And finally, it's where is how do we work as Christians to amplify the theological practice of inclusivity? The presence, acknowledging presence, or creating spaces for people to come and join with us. So perhaps that's something for us to also consider as we conclude this Talanoa today. Thank you.
Can I add just a short statement? So just a short one. So in our context, then I remember about the building narrative as well. Looking back on our recent situations, we almost have horizontal conflict between the indigenous and non-indigenous Papuan 2 months ago, and there are 6 people killed, but it wasn't be publicized. But then we realized that if you want to against racism and we have to make it explicit, then there is another problem, which is who is our enemy? I mean, who are our enemies in this journey fighting racism? That would be the questions in Papua, because it's so easy for some spoilers or some actors to, when we said on our protests in this August, September, the West Papuan people said that we are against this structural violence, this structural racism, but then we found ourselves almost have a conflict with our non-indigenous friends. So maybe that's how I understand that it's really important that this also about the building the narrative, and also about how to build the narrative that racism is a struggle against the dehumanizations, and not to bring it as a separatist movement. That is specifically in our context. So how do we move forward based on this very particular situation? I mean, that's very important to think about. How do we move forward, especially amid all of these stigmatizations and the politicizations in our context? So yeah, so that's for me.
Thank you, Elvira. Well, you put a good question across to all of us, something to think about in our regions. How do we move forward? Ohana means no one gets left behind, so we all need to move forward together as a region. I think this brings us to the close, unless anyone else would like to share another last comment. Well, I believe this is the last, we're the last to have our webinar for this Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace. We look forward to 2020 as the Pacific region will be the focus of PJP for next year. So thank you all for those of you that have joined us in different time zones, and we wish you all the best for the rest of the Advent season and the new year ahead. Minakavakale.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Reverend Seppi, for your wonderful moderation. And thank you very much to each of the speakers for your rich and insightful presentations. It's wonderful to know that some of us friends from other regions have joined us, including Reverend Wayi from Cameroon. He's been a faithful participant of all 8 webinars, and I'm happy that we know that other regions are connected. A lot of people from other regions were interested in the webinar, but because of the time difference, they've asked for the recording, so more feedback will come afterwards. But before my closing remarks, I'd just like to comment on a couple of things that I've heard. One is about the need for a theology of inclusiveness, a theology of belongingness, so that everyone feels included. So that was one thing that I will take with me. And another point was, I knew about Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, the terms, but I didn't know what they meant. And this was actually a very interesting learning for me, because it reminds me of a similar webinar we had focusing on the Caribbean context, where they talked about the issue of colorism. Colorism means that darker skinned people of color have to fight prejudice within their own community, where lighter skin is seen as more desirable. And I didn't know that Pacific had that as well. And I didn't know that Melanesia means the Black Islands, basically the Melanin Islands, if you take them. So just to let you know that one of the reasons we're doing these webinars is to find the common threads among the regions, and colorism was definitely one of them. It's a very lucrative business as well, because in several parts of the globe, unfortunately, because whiteness has been seen as the reference, this is one of the legacies of colonialism, of course, there is a big industry for people to have lighter skin. And this is a very lucrative business that you find in Africa, in Asia, and other contexts, very sadly. And but it was very interesting to see that even colorism comes back in the Pacific as well. So thank you so much. I've learned so much in this webinar. And I hope that this is just the beginning of a conversation. Webinars are not commonly used in other regions as well, but I think this is one good opportunity to use our smartphones. We're always living with our smartphones, but to connect and have conversations, not only to educate other regions, but also to learn among ourselves about the different nuances and specificities of issues we're struggling with within our region, and also a possibility to find possibilities of synergies and collaboration with other regions. As I have said in the beginning, this is the last webinars of a series of 8. We will prepare a report crystallizing the learning from each webinar, and that will be sent to our Central Committee who will be meeting next March, because it has been requested by the leadership of WCC and the governing body that racial justice be one of the priority areas in the years following the assembly, which will be in Germany in 2021. So this is just the beginning of a conversation, and we hope that in the coming years we'll have many more of these, but this time with participants from different regions within the webinar, not just regional. Thank you all. I know it's very late where you are. It's kind of early here, but I really appreciate, and I don't take for granted that some of you, like in Maui Nui, it's almost midnight, so I don't want to keep you long. It's dinner time for some. Thank you so much. Bulavinaka, merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. And let's stay in touch and continue to fight racial justice all together as an ecumenical family. Merci beaucoup. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.